Hello, my learning friends, and welcome to Hughes History. We have a special video on tap today. We're going to try something different because I really love history and I really love music, so I'm going to put them together and see if we can't do some musical historical videos about songs throughout American history that say something about history. How about that? And if you have an idea, you can leave it down in the comments below. But today, we're going to do one of my favorite songs of all time, one by the Beatles, 1968 White Album. It's called Blackbird, and believe it or not, it has some historical connections that are really important. So why don't you come with me on a journey of learning and music and history. And I don't do duck downs anymore. I just walk off screen because I'm grown up and such. So, in 1968, I think one of the best albums ever, it's called the White Album, was released by the Beatles. One of the most beautiful tracks, I think, on that album is a song called Blackbird. Most people think it's just kind of like a love song or a song about awakening, but when they asked Paul McCartney about the song, it's actually about civil rights. And in 1968, on April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And right around the same time, a couple of weeks later, that song was written by Paul McCartney in Scotland. And he has said that it specifically had to do with civil rights, because following April 4th, the assassination of Martin Luther King, there were massive riots throughout the United States, over 15 or 20 cities, Washington, D.C. being one of the biggest ones, in response to Martin Luther King being assassinated. So that song, Blackbird, is actually about civil rights. And bird in Great Britain is slang for girl. So it's actually Black Girl. And Paul McCartney was writing in his support of civil rights. One of the most famous lines of that song is, "You were only waiting for this moment to arise." And he's speaking directly to the African American community about, this is your time. This is your time to take those broken wings and to fly and to gain those civil rights. So we're going to talk really quickly about what was called the Holy Week riots, because that was what influenced Paul McCartney to write that song. And then we'll talk a little bit about that song, Blackbird, and how it was actually put together, which is actually an interesting story as well. So let's do that right now. So the Holy Week Uprising occurred from April 4th to April 8th in response to the assassination of Martin Luther King. One of the biggest cities was actually Washington, D.C., and there was over 15,000 protesters. And it's actually interesting to note that LBJ, who was president at the time, sent 20,000 military troops into Washington, D.C., making it the most heavily occupied city since the Civil War in 1968. They actually were guarding the White House. They had Marines and machine guns on the Capitol steps, so it was some pretty serious business. Baltimore, Kansas City, Detroit, Chicago, and there were many deaths and millions of dollars, and it took many of these cities years to renovate themselves. Also interesting is that there were two cities specifically that were kind of spared from the riots. One of them was Indianapolis, the other one was Boston. In Indianapolis was Bobby Kennedy, who actually broke the news to the crowd, and his speech actually calmed the crowd, and there were no riots in Indianapolis. And the other one, the godfather of soul in Boston, was James Brown. But James Brown had a concert in Boston that night, and him and some other officials had spoke to the crowd, had talked about peace, had calmed everything down. So Boston and Indianapolis were spared, but many other cities were not spared. So that's called the Holy Week Uprising. And when Paul McCartney read about this in the papers when he was in Scotland, he sat down and he penned the famous song Blackbird. So let's talk a little bit about Blackbird. So, unlike a lot of the songs that we'll probably be exploring in this series, is quite symbolic in its speaking to civil rights. It's very symbolic about take these broken wings, learn to fly, and Paul McCartney wanted to show his support for civil rights. What's also interesting in the song is there's no other Beatles on the song. There's only really 3 sounds in that song if you listen to it. There's Paul McCartney's voice, there's a classical guitar, which is actually a finger-picking technique that Donovan had taught Paul McCartney, and the only other sound is Paul McCartney's foot tapping. And then there's some Blackbird, male common Blackbird recording that's in the background as well. Those are the only sounds on that famous song, Blackbird. Unfortunately, that's not the only historical reference that Blackbird can lend its hand to. It was also used by Charles Manson to urge his followers to commit murders in 1969, the famous Manson murders. Two songs specifically on the White Album, Helter Skelter and Blackbird, were used by Manson to convince his followers that there was going to be a race riot. So when we hear the words, "You were only waiting for this moment to arise," Charles Manson sees that as a call to African Americans to start a race riot. But that's not what Paul McCartney had in mind. Paul McCartney, even a few years ago, met with some of the Little Rock Nine, you can see that photo right now, and talked about Blackbird and his support for civil rights. I encourage you to listen to it, and I encourage you to put some songs down in the comments below that you think have some historical connotations, some connections that you would like explored in one of these videos, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to do some music videos, but they're history videos, and we're going to put them together. All right, that's all I got for you guys. Thanks for watching. You know what I'm going to say, because I say it at the end of every video that I've ever done, because I mean it with all my heart. All right, my friends, where attention goes, energy flows, and we'll see you, my learning friends, next time that you press my buttons. I'm not ducking down. I'm just going to walk off in the sunset like this.